She was 13 years old, 13, and when the judge read the charges aloud, when the names of her own grandparents echoed through that cold courtroom, she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the confused grin of a child who doesn't understand what's happening. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach drop, the kind that tells you something behind those eyes has gone terribly quiet. The gallery stared. The prosecutor paused. Even the bailiff shifted on his feet. She sat there in a pressed blouse, hair neatly combed, looking like she was posing for a school portrait instead of facing a double homicide charge. She believed her age was a fortress. She believed the system would see a little girl and look away. But the judge sitting 20 feet from her had already reviewed the evidence files, and what he found inside it would make legal history. She didn't know it yet, but the smile she wore into that courtroom was about to be answered with a sentence no one her age had ever heard before. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. Because what happened in this case didn't just shock a courtroom. It forced an entire legal system to ask whether age can ever be an excuse when the evidence speaks louder than any argument. This is how it all began. Before the lawyers, before the forensic reports, before the courtroom cameras captured a 13-year-old girl smiling at her own murder charges, there was a house at the end of a quiet road in Collinsworth. It's a town so small that neighbors still left doors unlocked and waved from porches without thinking twice. The house belonged to Richard and Margaret Whitfield, both in their early 70s, both retired, both known in the community as the kind of people who showed up first when someone needed help. Richard had been a shop teacher for 31 years. Margaret volunteered at the church food pantry every Tuesday, without exception. They had raised their children in that same house, watched them grow, watched them leave, and then opened their door again when their granddaughter needed a place to stay. Her name was Chloe. She was 13, and she had been living with them for almost a year when the neighbors stopped hearing Margaret's wind chimes and Richard's morning radio. By the time anyone checked, the house was silent in a way that houses aren't supposed to be, and the only person still inside was the girl sitting on the couch, waiting as if she had been expecting someone to arrive. Collinsworth was the kind of town that didn't make the news. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, surrounded by farmland and timber, connected to the nearest city by a 2-lane highway that most people only used on weekends. The population hovered just under 4,000. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew someone who did. There was one grocery store, one gas station, 2 churches, and a school campus that served kindergarten through 12th grade, all in a row of connected buildings. Crime in Collinsworth meant a stolen lawnmower or a teenager caught spray painting the water tower. People didn't lock their cars. Some didn't lock their houses. It wasn't recklessness. It was trust, the kind of trust that only exists in places where nothing terrible has ever happened. And for decades, nothing terrible had. The town moved with a rhythm as steady as its church bells. Seasons changed, kids grew up, old folks aged in place, and the world's violence stayed safely on the other side of a television screen. Richard and Margaret Whitfield had lived on Miller Lane for over 40 years. The house was a single-story brick ranch with a wide porch, a vegetable garden along the south side, and a flagpole Richard had installed the year he retired. He raised the flag every morning and brought it down every evening, a ritual so precise that neighbors joked they could set their watches by it. Margaret kept the interior immaculate. Her kitchen smelled like coffee and cinnamon in the mornings and like roasted vegetables in the evenings. The living room had a shelf of family photos that stretched from faded Polaroids to recent digital prints. Every grandchild had a frame. Every holiday had a snapshot. The house wasn't fancy, but it was loved in the way that only decades of care can produce. It was the kind of home that made visitors feel safe without knowing why. It was sturdy, warm, predictable. It was the last place on earth you would expect to become a crime scene. Richard was 72, broad-shouldered, and quieter than people expected from a man his size. He had spent his career teaching teenagers how to use saws, lathes, and drills without losing fingers, which required a patience most people never develop. He spoke slowly, chose his words carefully, and had a habit of listening longer than others thought necessary before offering an opinion. Neighbors described him as dependable, the man who plowed driveways in winter without being asked, who fixed fence posts and never sent a bill. He had served in the military briefly before teaching and carried that discipline into everything. His workshop in the garage was organized with the kind of precision that borders on philosophy. Every tool had a place, every surface was swept clean. Richard believed that order was a form of respect for materials, for time, for the people who would use what he built. Margaret was 69, smaller than Richard in every physical way, but larger in social gravity. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who brought casseroles to grieving families. Who organized the church rummage sale with the efficiency of a field general. She had worked as a school secretary for 20 years before retiring, and in that role she had learned the names of hundreds of children, their parents, their allergies, their fears. People trusted Margaret instinctively because she remembered details about their lives that even close friends forgot. She asked about your mother's hip surgery. She remembered your dog's name. She noticed when you seemed tired and said so gently. In Collinsworth, Margaret Whitfield was the closest thing to a communal conscience, the woman who held the town's emotional fabric together with small, consistent acts of attention. Together, Richard and Margaret had raised 3 children, all of whom had moved to larger towns or cities for work. Their youngest daughter, Karen, had struggled the most. She had battled substance issues on and off since her early 20s, cycling through periods of stability and collapse with a rhythm that exhausted everyone who loved her. Karen had a daughter, Chloe, born when Karen was 26. For the first few years, Karen managed. Then the relapses began again, each one deeper and longer. By the time Chloe was 12, Karen had lost custody through a court process that was more slow erosion than dramatic event. The state placed Chloe with Richard and Margaret, and the grandparents accepted without hesitation. They converted the spare bedroom, bought new bedding, stocked the bathroom with products a teenage girl might need, and enrolled Chloe in the local school. They believed, with the stubborn optimism of people who have fixed broken things their whole lives, that love and structure could repair whatever damage had already been done. Chloe arrived at Miller Lane with a duffel bag and a silence that Margaret found unsettling. The girl was polite but hollow, saying the right words without the warmth that should accompany them. She thanked Margaret for dinner without tasting it. She told Richard the bedroom was nice without looking at it. Over the following weeks, Margaret tried to decode the silence. She attributed it to grief, to dislocation, to the natural awkwardness of a child living with grandparents she had only seen on holidays. Chloe enrolled in 7th grade, attended classes, completed assignments at a level teachers called adequate. She didn't make close friends, but she didn't cause trouble either. She existed in a middle space that adults often mistake for adjustment. Margaret wrote in her planner, beneath a list of grocery needs, a small note to herself. It said simply, "Ask Chloe how she feels." The note stayed on the page, unchecked, for weeks, not because Margaret forgot, but because every time she asked, Chloe's answer was the same flat word: fine. As months passed, small tensions surfaced like cracks in drying clay. Chloe resented the routines Richard and Margaret maintained. The early dinners, the limited screen time, the expectation that she would help in the garden and keep her room tidy. She didn't rage against them. She simply went still, compliant on the surface and resistant underneath, the way water resists a dam, by pressing constantly without making a sound. Richard noticed that tools in his garage had been moved, not stolen, just touched and not returned to their places. While Margaret noticed that Chloe's browser history, checked gently and not as surveillance but as concern, showed searches about emancipation, about running away, about what happens when grandparents die. Margaret told herself it was curiosity. She told herself 13-year-olds search for dark things the way they try on costumes. She told Richard, who frowned and said they should talk to the school counselor. They made an appointment. It was scheduled for the following week. By then, it would be too late. The last photograph of the Whitfield house before the crime was taken by a neighbor testing a new phone camera. It shows the porch in late afternoon light, the flag at rest, Margaret's flower pots bright along the railing. It looks like peace. It looks like the kind of house where bad things simply do not occur. But the most dangerous crimes are the ones that grow quietly inside safe places, fertilized by proximity and trust. And inside that house, beneath the routines and the wind chimes and the smell of Margaret's kitchen, something had already shifted. The girl in the spare bedroom had stopped pretending to adjust. She had started planning instead. The flag still flew the morning they were found. Chloe Whitfield had learned, before most children learn long division, that the world was a place where people left. Her earliest memories were fragmented. An apartment that smelled like smoke and neglect, a mother who was present one week and absent the next, replaced by a rotating cast of strangers who watched television too loudly and never asked if Chloe had eaten. Karen loved her daughter in the abstract way that people with addictions love anything that isn't the substance. She loved Chloe when she was sober, which meant she loved her intermittently, unpredictably, and with an intensity that always carried the silent footnote of eventual disappearance. By the time Chloe was 8, she had lived in 4 different apartments, attended 3 different schools, and been temporarily placed with a family friend twice. Each disruption taught her the same lesson. Do not rely on anyone. Do not expect stability. And most importantly, do not let anyone see what you actually feel, because feelings are leverage other people use against you. By the time the court finalized the custody arrangement and placed Chloe with Richard and Margaret, the girl had already developed a sophisticated internal architecture of self-protection. She could read a room faster than most adults. She knew when someone was about to be angry before they raised their voice. She knew when a smile was genuine and when it was performance. She cataloged people's habits the way other children collected cards or stickers, not for fun, but for survival, because knowing someone's pattern meant knowing when they were dangerous. This skill, born from chaos, looked like maturity to teachers and social workers. They wrote things in reports like well-adjusted and resilient. Those words made the adults feel better. They had nothing to do with what was actually happening inside Chloe's mind, which was quieter, colder, and far more organized than anyone suspected. At school in Collinsworth, Chloe occupied a strategic middle ground. She was not popular, not bullied, not exceptional, not failing. She was present in the way that a chair is present, functional and unnoticed. Teachers found her easy to overlook because she never disrupted and never excelled. Her assignments were completed with mechanical precision, showing understanding but never enthusiasm. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't volunteer for projects. When forced into group work, she contributed just enough to avoid complaint and not enough to attract attention. One teacher, years later, would describe Chloe as the student you forget is in the room until you look at the seating chart. That invisibility was not accidental. It was a skill Chloe had refined since childhood, the ability to become background noise, to exist without registering. And because attention from adults had historically meant either unwanted affection or unpredictable punishment. Her social life was similarly curated. She had acquaintances but not friends, people she sat near at lunch but never invited anywhere. Classmates found her pleasant enough in short interactions and vaguely unsettling in longer ones. One girl later told investigators that Chloe sometimes said things that sounded like jokes but felt like tests, small comments about what she would do if she could disappear, or how easy it would be to start over somewhere no one knew her name. The girl laughed them off at the time. Teenagers say dramatic things constantly, and most of it means nothing. But in retrospect, Those comments formed a pattern, a recurring fantasy of erasure, of becoming someone new by removing everything old. Chloe didn't talk about hurting people. She talked about freedom, and in her vocabulary, freedom required the elimination of obstacles, not the negotiation of them. At home, Chloe's relationship with Margaret was a carefully managed performance. She accepted Margaret's affection with the tolerance of someone enduring a medical procedure, holding still, waiting for it to end. She answered Margaret's questions with enough detail to satisfy, but never enough to reveal. When Margaret hugged her, Chloe's arms rose mechanically, a mirror of the gesture without the warmth behind it. Margaret sensed the gap but filled it with hope, telling herself and Richard that attachment takes time, that a child from Chloe's background cannot be expected to trust overnight. The school counselor, during an introductory session, agreed, noting that Chloe showed signs of attachment disruption consistent with early instability. The counselor recommended patience and consistency. Those were reasonable recommendations for a child who was struggling. They were inadequate recommendations for a child who had stopped struggling and started calculating. With Richard, the dynamic was different and more volatile beneath the surface. Richard's discipline, his schedules and expectations, and quiet insistence on order triggered something in Chloe that she could not fully articulate but deeply resented. He reminded her of systems, of rules imposed by people who claimed authority over her body and her time. She complied because non-compliance attracted attention, but her compliance was laced with a contempt she occasionally let slip. A rolled eye when Richard asked her to set the table. A beat of silence too long when he reminded her about chores. Richard, a patient man, absorbed these small rebellions without confrontation. He believed, with the teacher's faith in repetition, that modeling good behavior would eventually be absorbed. He did not understand that Chloe was not absorbing the lessons. She was studying the teacher. In the months before the crime, Chloe's internet activity shifted in ways that would only become significant later. She began researching topics that individually seemed like ordinary teenage curiosity, but collectively formed a disturbing constellation. She searched for how long investigations take in small towns, what evidence police look for first, whether minors can be tried as adults, and how cleaning products affect biological traces. She also searched for bus routes out of Collinsworth and how much money a person needs to live alone. She cleared her history regularly, which Margaret noticed and attributed to the normal privacy instincts of a teenager. But Chloe wasn't hiding embarrassing searches. She was hiding a curriculum. She was educating herself the way her grandfather educated students, methodically, patiently, with an end project in mind. The difference was that Richard's students built bookshelves and birdhouses. Chloe was building something that could not be displayed. One evening, about 2 weeks before the murders, Margaret found Chloe sitting on the back porch, in the dark, perfectly still, staring at the tree line behind the house. Margaret asked if she was okay. Chloe said yes, without turning around. Margaret lingered, then went inside, unsettled in a way she could not name. She mentioned it to Richard, who said the girl probably just needed air. That moment, unremarkable at the time, would haunt Margaret's sister for years afterward because it was the last time anyone had a chance to see what was coming and didn't. The porch light cast Chloe's shadow long across the yard, stretching toward the darkness like it was reaching for something the light couldn't touch. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be free. The final normal day on Miller Lane moved with the kind of gentle predictability that Richard and Margaret had spent a lifetime building. Richard woke at 6, as he always did, made coffee in the same percolator he had used for 15 years, and stepped onto the porch to raise the flag. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint sweetness of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Margaret joined him at 6:30, already dressed, already listing the day's tasks in her mind. She had a hair appointment at 10 and planned to stop at the grocery store on the way home. Richard intended to spend the morning in his workshop, sharpening a set of chisels he had been meaning to tend to for weeks. Chloe was still in her room, door closed, presumably asleep. The house breathed with the rhythm of routine, each person moving through their orbit like planets in a quiet solar system. Chloe appeared for breakfast at 7:15, later than usual, but not late enough to draw comment. She ate toast standing at the counter, scrolling through her phone with the vacant focus that teenagers apply to screens the way previous generations applied it to television. Margaret asked about school. Chloe said it was fine. Richard mentioned that the weather was supposed to turn cold later in the week and asked if Chloe needed a warmer jacket. She said no. The conversation had the texture of thousands of identical mornings, words exchanged not for information, but for the reassurance of contact, the social equivalent of sonar. Everyone was present, everyone was accounted for, the system was functioning. Margaret left for her appointment. Richard went to the garage. Chloe went to school. The house emptied and waited, the way houses do, patient and indifferent. At school, Chloe moved through her classes with the usual mechanical compliance. She turned in a worksheet in social studies, sat through a math lecture without raising her hand, and ate lunch at her regular spot near the window. A classmate asked if she wanted to join a group project on Friday. Chloe said maybe, which everyone understood meant no. Her teachers later reported nothing unusual about that day. No outbursts, no absences, no behavioral flags. She was the same Chloe she had always been, present and invisible. One detail would emerge later from a student who sat behind her in English class. During a reading period, the student noticed Chloe wasn't reading. She was writing in a small notebook, quickly, with the focused intensity of someone working against a deadline. When the bell rang, Chloe closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag without looking up. The student thought nothing of it. Teenagers write in notebooks. It is among the most ordinary things a person can do. That afternoon, Margaret returned home with groceries and a fresh haircut she was quietly pleased about. She put away the food, started preparing dinner, and called out to Chloe, who had come home from school and gone directly to her room. Chloe emerged, helped set the table without being asked, which pleased Margaret and which she interpreted as progress. Dinner was pot roast, a recipe Margaret had made so many times she could assemble it without consulting notes. Richard washed his hands at the kitchen sink, smelling faintly of wood shavings and machine oil. They sat together. They ate. Richard talked about a neighbor's fence that needed repair. Margaret mentioned the church was looking for volunteers for an upcoming event. Chloe listened, or appeared to listen, and offered nothing. After dinner, she cleared her plate, thanked Margaret, and returned to her room. The door clicked shut with the soft finality that had become her signature sound in the house. That evening, around 8 o'clock, a small conflict emerged that would later take on enormous weight in the investigation. Richard noticed that a utility knife was missing from his workshop pegboard. He asked Chloe if she had borrowed it. She said no, flatly, without elaboration. Richard frowned, but didn't press. He assumed he had misplaced it, which was unlike him, but not impossible. Margaret, overhearing from the kitchen, suggested he check the garden shed. He did. It wasn't there. The missing knife bothered Richard the way a misplaced word bothers a writer, not urgently but persistently, a small wrongness in an otherwise ordered world. He mentioned it once more before bed. Chloe, passing through the hallway, said nothing. The knife would not be found in the workshop. It would be found somewhere else entirely, and its location would become one of the prosecution's most damning exhibits. Later that night, the house settled into its familiar pattern of sleep. Richard turned off the living room lights at 9:30. Margaret read in bed until 10, then switched off her lamp. Chloe's light, visible as a thin stripe beneath her door, stayed on longer. Margaret noticed, but did not intervene. Teenagers keep late hours. It is the nature of adolescence to resist the schedule of the house. By 11, the stripe of light disappeared, and the house went fully dark. Outside, the neighborhood was silent except for the occasional car on the distant highway and the rhythmic chirping of insects in the warm grass. The flag hung limp on its pole, but no wind to move it. The porch light stayed on, as it always did, casting a yellow circle that reached just past the first step, and no farther. What happened between midnight and dawn would be reconstructed later through forensic evidence, digital records, and the careful work of investigators who treated the house like a text to be read word by word. But on that last ordinary evening, none of it had happened yet. The pot roast dishes were washed and stacked. The garden tools were put away. The beds were made and occupied. The house on Miller Lane looked exactly like what it had always been, a place of safety, a place of routine, a place where two people who had spent their lives caring for others slept with the deep trust of those who believe the world inside their walls is under control. That belief had approximately 4 hours left to live. The porch light stayed on, like it was waiting for something that wouldn't come. The first indication that something had gone wrong inside the Whitfield home came not from a scream or a crash, but from silence. The kind of silence that builds slowly and doesn't register until someone notices the absence of what should be there. At 6:15 the next morning, a neighbor named Gerald Pruitt, who walked his dog past the Whitfield house every day, noticed the flag was not raised. In 40 years, Gerald had never seen Richard miss the morning flag. He paused on the sidewalk, looked at the porch, and saw nothing unusual except stillness. The curtains were drawn. The porch light, which usually clicked off at dawn via timer, was still on, glowing weakly against the daylight. But Gerald continued his walk, telling himself Richard might be sick. He told himself this because the alternative was unthinkable, and because small towns survive on the assumption that deviation from routine is temporary. By 9 o'clock, Margaret had not appeared at the church pantry, and 2 volunteers noticed her absence with the mild concern that precedes real worry. One called Margaret's phone. It rang to voicemail. The other called the house line. No answer. They assumed a scheduling mix-up. But at 10:30, when Margaret still hadn't appeared or called, one of the volunteers phoned Richard's cell. It too went to voicemail. A thread of unease began to pull through the small community. Gerald Pruitt, still thinking about the flag, mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to a neighbor, who decided to walk over and knock. But the knock echoed. No one answered. The neighbor peered through a side window and saw the living room in its usual state, undisturbed. She knocked again, louder. Then she called the non-emergency police line and said she was worried about the elderly couple on Miller Lane. A single patrol officer arrived at 11:14. Officer Beth Calder had been with the Collinsworth Department for 6 years and had responded to welfare checks before, most of which ended with an embarrassed homeowner explaining they had overslept or gone out of town. She knocked, announced herself, and waited. Silence. She walked the perimeter, checking doors and windows. Everything appeared locked and intact. No broken glass, no forced entry, no signs of disturbance. She returned to the front door and knocked once more, harder. Then the door opened. Chloe stood in the gap, hair uncombed, wearing pajamas, expression blank. She looked at the officer the way one might look at a delivery driver arriving with a package for someone else. Officer Calder asked if everything was okay. Chloe paused, then said, in a voice so steady it felt rehearsed, that she had woken up and her grandparents wouldn't wake up. She said it the way someone reports a broken appliance. Officer Calder entered the home and found what the silence had been concealing. Richard and Margaret Whitfield were in their bedroom, in their bed, deceased. The scene was startlingly undisturbed. The covers were pulled to normal sleeping positions. The nightstand held Margaret's reading glasses and a glass of water. Richard's slippers were paired neatly beside the bed. It looked, at first glance, like a natural passing on 2 elderly people who died in their sleep. But Officer Calder had been trained to observe before concluding, and what she observed did not match the peaceful tableau. There were small but unmistakable signs of harm, subtle marks on bedding, discoloration that didn't align with natural causes, a faint chemical odor beneath the room's stale air, something astringent, something that didn't belong. Calder backed out of the room, keyed her radio, and called for backup and medical response. Her voice was controlled, but her hand trembled slightly against the radio. Within the hour, the house on Miller Lane transformed. Patrol cars lined the curb. Yellow tape marked the perimeter. Neighbors gathered in clusters across the street, arms folded, faces tight with the particular fear that comes when violence visits a place that believed itself immune. Paramedics confirmed what Officer Calder already knew. The medical examiner was called. Crime scene technicians from the county were dispatched. The house, which had been a home that morning, was now a sealed environment, every surface a potential witness, every object a potential exhibit. Inside, technicians moved with deliberate slowness, photographing, measuring, cataloging. Outside, Chloe sat on the curb wrapped in a blanket provided by an EMT. She did not cry. She did not shake. She watched the activity with an expression that one officer later described with visible discomfort as interested. When a detective approached Chloe gently and asked her to describe what happened, she delivered a compact narrative. She said she went to sleep, woke up late, tried to rouse her grandparents, and couldn't. She said she didn't hear anything during the night. She said she was scared, but her body did not perform fear. Her eyes were dry, her hands rested flat on her knees. She answered questions with the measured pacing of someone who has anticipated them, as if she had rehearsed not just the answers, but the order in which they would be needed. The detective noted this in his report with a single underlined word, followed by a question mark. It was the word that would eventually become the investigation's compass, pointing toward the person sitting right in front of them. As technicians worked inside, one detail emerged that shifted the investigation's direction before the first autopsy was complete. The utility knife Richard had reported missing from his workshop was found in the kitchen trash, wrapped in a paper towel, wiped but not thoroughly cleaned. Its placement was inconsistent with household use and consistent with concealment. A knife missing from a controlled environment, found hidden in the same home where two people were discovered dead, is not a coincidence. It is a sentence waiting to be diagrammed. Detectives bagged it, tagged it, and added it to a growing inventory of objects that would eventually testify more reliably than any human witness. The house was speaking, one artifact at a time, in a language that required patience to translate but could not be silenced. The door opened from the inside. So did the truth. And the medical examiner's findings arrived with the clinical precision that strips tragedy down to biology. Richard and Margaret Whitfield had not died peacefully in their sleep. The examination revealed evidence of sedation, likely administered through ingested substances, followed by physical harm inflicted while the victims were incapacitated. The medical details were documented with professional restraint, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Both deaths were classified as homicides. The sedation explained the undisturbed bedroom, the covers still in place, the slippers still paired. The victims had been rendered helpless before anything else occurred. That level of preparation, sedation followed by action, indicated planning, not impulse. Someone had thought this through. Someone had wanted the scene to look like sleep. Toxicology reports identified the sedating agent as an over-the-counter sleep medication administered in doses far exceeding therapeutic levels. Investigators later determined that a large bottle of the same medication, purchased at a pharmacy 2 towns over, had been bought with cash approximately 10 days before the murders. Store security footage, once obtained through warrant, showed a figure consistent with a young female making the purchase. The pharmacy's policy did not require identification for the product. It was available on any shelf, in any store, to anyone who could reach it. The ordinariness of the method was part of what made the case so disturbing. This was not an exotic poison or a sophisticated compound. It was something sold next to cough drops and vitamins. The gap between the banality of the tool and the enormity of the act created a dissonance that investigators carried with them throughout the case. The timeline reconstruction began with the digital evidence that modern homes generate without anyone's conscious participation. The house's thermostat, a smart device connected to a home network, logged temperature adjustments. At 1:47 in the morning, someone lowered the thermostat by 4 degrees, a change consistent with someone who was awake and moving through the house, not someone asleep. Chloe's phone, analyzed through warrant-authorized extraction, showed screen activations at 12:15, 1:30, and 2:10, each lasting only seconds, consistent with checking the time. Her claim of uninterrupted sleep was contradicted not by a human witness, but by the passive recording of her own device. The phone didn't care about her story. It simply documented what happened and waited for someone to ask. Chloe's initial statement to police contained 3 factual claims that the evidence dismantled one by one. She said she slept through the night. The phone and thermostat data disagreed. She said she didn't hear anything unusual. The medical findings showed the victims were sedated, meaning there would have been a period of administration, a window during which someone moved through the house with purpose. She said she found her grandparents unresponsive in the morning and panicked. But her 911 demeanor, the delayed call, and the complete absence of physical distress markers told a different story. Investigators recognized the pattern. The lies were not random. They were structural, designed to support a narrative that required Chloe to be passive, asleep, and innocent. The problem with structural lies is that they depend on every beam holding weight simultaneously. When one beam fails, the architecture collapses. The utility knife recovered from the kitchen trash was examined for biological traces. Results confirmed the presence of material consistent with both victims. The knife had been wiped, but not with the thoroughness that forensic science requires to achieve true obliteration. A 13-year-old, no matter how methodical, operates within the limits of a 13-year-old's understanding of evidence. Chloe had researched cleaning methods online, but internet advice is not a forensic education. The traces remained, are invisible to the naked eye, but luminous under laboratory analysis. Additionally, a partial fingerprint was recovered from the knife handle, consistent with Chloe's prints taken as part of the household elimination process. Defense attorneys would later challenge the clarity of the print. Prosecutors would respond with the cumulative weight of everything else. A single thread might snap. A rope does not. Behavioral analysis during the first 48 hours added a layer of psychological evidence that, while not forensic in nature, provided context for the physical findings. Chloe did not ask to call her mother. She did not ask about her grandparents' condition after being told they were deceased. She asked about her phone, which had been taken as evidence, and whether she would need to change schools. A child advocacy worker assigned to Chloe reported that the girl seemed preoccupied with logistics rather than grief, asking when she could get her belongings, whether she would be placed in foster care, and how long the investigation would take. The worker noted that Chloe displayed no startled response, no nightmares, and no attachment behavior toward comfort objects or familiar adults. The worker's report used careful clinical language, but the subtext was alarm. Investigators were now operating with a clear hypothesis. The evidence pointed inward, toward the only other occupant of the house. But hypotheses require testing, and in a case involving a minor suspect, the margin for error is thinner because the consequences of wrongful accusation and the consequences of misjustice are equally devastating. Detectives requested additional warrants for Chloe's school locker, her digital accounts, and the notebook a classmate had observed her writing in during English class. Each warrant was a door, and behind each door they expected to find more of what they had already found, a trail of preparation that Chloe believed she had erased, but that the world had quietly preserved. The investigation was no longer asking whether something happened. It was asking how a 13-year-old built a plan and nearly made it look like nothing at all. The medicine was over the counter. The intent was underneath everything. The notebook was recovered from Chloe's school locker 3 days after the murders. It was a standard composition book, black and white marbled cover, the kind sold in bulk at office supply stores and used by millions of students for class notes. Chloe had used it for something else entirely. The first several pages contained what appeared to be normal school notes, dates and vocabulary words, and a doodled margin. But beginning around page 14, the content shifted. The handwriting became smaller, tighter, more deliberate. Entries were dated, but not daily. They read like a project log, a sequential record of research, planning, and rehearsal. Investigators who had spent careers reviewing evidence described the notebook as one of the most unsettling documents they had encountered, not because of graphic content, but because of its tone. It was calm. It was organized. It was the work of a mind that had moved past emotion and into execution. The notebook entries detailed Chloe's observations of her grandparents' routines with a precision that echoed Richard's own methodical nature, a bitter irony that would not be lost on prosecutors. She had recorded what time Richard and Margaret went to bed, which doors they locked, which lights they left on, how deeply they slept, and how long it took Margaret to fall asleep after turning off her lamp. She noted that Richard took a blood pressure medication at bedtime that made him groggy, and that Margaret always drank a glass of warm milk before sleeping. Those details weren't just observations. They were vulnerabilities, cataloged for exploitation. The notebook didn't use violent language. It used the language of logistics, words like timing, access, and sequence, as if the plan were a school project with deliverables and deadlines. One entry, dated approximately 2 weeks before the murders, contained a sentence that prosecutors would later read aloud in court with devastating effect. It said, in Chloe's neat handwriting, "After the milk, but before the lamp." That sentence contained no explicit threat, no statement of intent that a defense attorney couldn't attempt to reframe. But in context, surrounded by the detailed routine mapping and the subsequent events, it functioned as a timestamp for premeditation. It showed that Chloe had identified a specific window of vulnerability, a moment when her grandmother would be most susceptible to ingesting something unnoticed. The simplicity of the language made it worse. There was no anger in the words. There was no conflict. There was only the cold arithmetic of opportunity. Digital forensics provided a parallel record that corroborated and expanded the notebook's contents. Chloe's search history, partially deleted but recovered through device extraction, showed a pattern of research spanning several weeks. She had searched for the effects of sleep medication overdose, how long it takes for sedatives to work, whether certain cleaning agents destroy biological evidence, and how police investigate deaths of elderly people. She had also searched for Greyhound bus schedules, the cost of prepaid phone cards, and how to open a bank account as a minor. The searches formed 2 tracks, one for the crime and one for the escape. Neither track showed hesitation. There were no searches for helplines, no searches for how to talk to grandparents about problems, and no searches suggesting she considered any alternative to what she eventually did. The digital trail was a mirror of the notebook. It showed a straight line. One search result Chloe had clicked on was particularly revealing. It was a true crime article about a case in which a teenager had been acquitted due to insufficient physical evidence. Chloe had bookmarked it. The article described how the accused teenager avoided conviction by leaving no fingerprints and providing a consistent alibi. Chloe appeared to have studied it as a template, a how-to guide disguised as journalism. She adapted its lessons imperfectly, wiping the knife but leaving trace evidence, deleting searches but not understanding cloud backups, maintaining a story but failing to account for the thermostat log and phone data. Her plan was sophisticated for a 13-year-old and fatally incomplete by adult forensic standards. She had done her homework, but the homework wasn't enough. Investigators also recovered messages from a social media account Chloe maintained under a pseudonym. The account was sparse, mostly used to follow content rather than post. But a direct message exchange with an anonymous contact, never fully identified, but believed to be another minor she had connected with through an online forum, contained conversations about wanting to start over, about how families are prisons, and about what it would mean to be completely free. The tone was not playful. It was ideological, as if Chloe had constructed a philosophy around her resentment and was testing it against another person's reactions. The contact responded with vague encouragement, but nothing concrete. The exchange mattered not as evidence of conspiracy, but as evidence of interior life, proof that Chloe had been narrating her plan to herself long before she executed it, building a story in which she was the protagonist escaping captivity rather than a child harming the people who loved her most. When confronted with the notebook during a subsequent interview conducted in the presence of a juvenile advocate and legal counsel, Chloe's composure shifted for the first time. She did not cry. She did not confess. But her face tightened, and her eyes moved to the notebook with a recognition that was impossible to fake. She knew what was in those pages because she had written every word. Her attorney requested the interview be paused. Chloe sat in silence, or hands flat on the table, staring at the composition book as if it had betrayed her. In a way, it had. She had trusted paper the way she trusted no person, pouring her plans into its pages because she believed pages were private. She had forgotten the fundamental rule of evidence, the rule her grandfather might have taught her if he had known she needed it. Nothing written is ever truly gone. It only waits to be found. She planned on paper. The paper planned her conviction. The formal interview took place in a room designed to be unremarkable. Neutral walls, a table, 2 chairs on one side and one on the other, a camera mounted in the corner with a small red light that never blinked off. Chloe entered with her court-appointed attorney and a juvenile advocate, both of whom had reviewed the parameters carefully. Once investigators understood the rules governing juvenile interrogation, there would be no raised voices, no deceptive tactics that crossed constitutional lines, no marathon sessions. The lead detective, a woman named Sandra Morales, who had spent 14 years in homicide investigation, kept her voice at the level of a school librarian. She offered water. Chloe accepted. She offered a break whenever needed. Chloe nodded. The courtesies were genuine and tactical at the same time, because the best interrogations don't feel like interrogations. They feel like conversations. And conversations are where people make mistakes. Chloe began with the same story she had told Officer Calder. She went to sleep. She woke up. Her grandparents were not responsive. She called for help. The narrative was delivered with the same flat precision as before, each sentence placed like a tile in a predetermined pattern. Detective Morales listened without interrupting, letting Chloe build the entire structure before testing any of its joints. When Chloe finished, Morales thanked her and then began asking questions that sounded casual but were surgically placed. What did you have for dinner? Did your grandmother seem tired? What time did you brush your teeth? What was the last thing you said to your grandfather? Each question was a probe, not for facts alone, but for consistency. Because liars can prepare answers to expected questions. They stumble on the unexpected ones. The first visible crack appeared when Morales asked about the thermostat. She mentioned it conversationally as if it were a routine detail. She said the system showed a temperature change around 1:47 in the morning and asked if Chloe remembered being cold. Chloe hesitated. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds, but in interrogation, 2 seconds is an ocean. She said she didn't remember. Morales nodded, moved on, then circled back minutes later from a different angle. Did Chloe ever adjust the thermostat at night? Chloe said no, she didn't know how. That answer contradicted the home's records, which showed only 3 user profiles, and Chloe's had been used before for minor adjustments. The lie was small. Its implications were not. Morales then shifted to the utility knife, displaying a photograph of it recovered from the kitchen trash. She asked Chloe if she recognized it. Chloe said it looked like one of Richard's tools. Morales asked if Chloe had ever used it. Well, Chloe said no. Morales asked if Chloe knew how it ended up in the kitchen trash, wrapped in a paper towel. Chloe said she had no idea. Maybe her grandfather threw it away. The detective let the answer sit in the room like an object both of them could see. The explanation required Richard to have removed his own tool from the workshop, used it, wrapped it in a paper towel, and discarded it in the kitchen, all while following none of his established habits. It was an answer that only worked if you didn't know Richard Whitfield. And everyone in Collinsworth knew Richard Whitfield. The pivotal moment came when Morales introduced the notebook. She placed it on the table between them, unopened, and simply asked, "Is this yours?" Chloe's eyes dropped to it with the speed of recognition. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't say she'd never seen it. She stared at it for several seconds, and in those seconds, the temperature of the room changed. Her attorney leaned in. The juvenile advocate shifted in her chair. Chloe said, in a voice quieter than anything she had produced before, "That's my school notebook." Morales opened it to page 14 and asked Chloe to explain the entries. Chloe looked at the handwriting, her own handwriting, and for the first time, she had no prepared answer. She said she didn't remember writing those things. She said sometimes she wrote stories. She said it was fiction. The word fiction landed in the room with the weight of its own impossibility, because fiction doesn't include your grandmother's bedtime routine, timed to the minute. After a requested break, during which Chloe conferred with her attorney, the interview resumed with a notable shift in Chloe's demeanor. The flat composure had cracked into something harder, more defensive. She answered questions with single words. She shrugged frequently. She looked at the camera once, directly, with an expression that observers later described differently. Some called it defiance. Some called it exhaustion. One investigator called it recognition, the look of someone who understands the game is ending but refuses to concede. Morales did not push for a confession. She didn't need one. The evidence was already speaking more fluently than Chloe ever could, and every denial Chloe offered became another brick in the wall of her own inconsistency. The interview ended after 2 hours and 14 minutes. Chloe was returned to the juvenile facility where she was being held. Detective Morales sat in the empty room for several minutes afterward, reviewing her notes, replaying the session mentally. She had interviewed adults who killed for money, for jealousy, for rage. This was different. Chloe's presentation was not emotional. It was administrative. She had not killed in the heat of a moment. She had followed a checklist. And the most disturbing part, Morales would later tell a colleague, was not what Chloe said. It was what she never said. In 2 hours of conversation about the deaths of the 2 people who had taken her in and tried to give her a life, Chloe never once said their names. The room was designed to be neutral. The truth inside it was not. News of the arrest moved through Collinsworth the way fire moves through dry timber, fast, hot, and impossible to contain. The idea that Richard and Margaret Whitfield, 2 of the most beloved people in town, had been killed was devastating enough. The idea that their 13-year-old granddaughter was the suspect broke something deeper, a communal assumption about the nature of children, the safety of homes, and the reliability of goodness as a shield against harm. People gathered at the diner, at the church, at the gas station parking lot, talking in low voices with the specific intensity of people trying to reconcile what they know with what they feel. Some expressed rage, some expressed disbelief, some expressed a quieter, more complicated emotion, guilt, as if the community should have seen something, should have intervened, should have looked more carefully at the girl who sat on the curb and did not cry. The church where Margaret volunteered held a memorial service 5 days after the murders. The pews were full in a way they hadn't been since Christmas. Richard's flag was mentioned. Margaret's Tuesday pantry shifts were mentioned. A former student of Richard's, now in his 40s, stood and described how Richard had once stayed 2 hours after school to help him rebuild a crooked joint on a cabinet, telling him, "Measure twice, because the wood only forgives once." The man's voice cracked, and the church went silent with the particular hush that comes when grief finds its most precise expression. People left the service holding on to each other, and several drove past the Whitfield house afterward, slowing without stopping, looking at the yellow tape and the darkened windows as if the house itself might offer an explanation. And the arrest also detonated a secondary explosion, the debate over juvenile justice. Collinsworth was not a place accustomed to debating legal philosophy, but the case forced it. At the hardware store, a man argued that Chloe should face adult consequences. At the school pickup line, a mother countered that 13 is too young for adult court. Online forums connected to local news sites became arenas of fury and confusion, strangers arguing about brain development and moral culpability with the passion of people who had never thought about these issues until they arrived at their doorstep. The debate was not abstract. It was Margaret's face in a framed photo. It was Richard's flag on a pole. It was a girl in a holding facility who looked like anyone's daughter and behaved like no one's child. Karen, Chloe's mother. I surfaced briefly during this period. She called the police department from a city 3 hours away, initially frantic, then confused, then defensive. She demanded to see Chloe, was told the process for visitation, and did not follow through for several days. When she finally appeared at the juvenile facility, staff reported that the visit was short and awkward. 2 people who shared blood but not language, separated by glass and years of absence. Karen told a reporter outside the facility that Chloe was a good kid who had been through a lot. The quote was published alongside a photo of Margaret's flower pots on the porch. The juxtaposition said everything the reporter didn't need to write. Karen's presence in the narrative was a reminder that Chloe's story did not begin with the murders. It began with a childhood that no one had adequately protected, a fact that would become the defense's primary emotional instrument. Chloe's school struggled with the aftermath. Students who had sat beside her in class now had to process the concept that someone they knew, someone who borrowed pencils and ate lunch near the window, was accused of killing 2 elderly people. The school brought in counselors. Assemblies were held with vague, careful language about feelings and support. Teachers were given scripts. But scripts don't answer the question a 7th grader actually asks, which is not how do I process this, but could someone I know really do that? The question is about proximity, about the terrifying possibility that normalcy can be a mask and that you might never know who is wearing one. That question doesn't have a reassuring answer, which is why the counselors tended to redirect it toward breathing exercises and available resources. Amid the community's grief, investigators continued building the case with a discipline that existed apart from public emotion. Forensic results were finalized. Digital evidence was cataloged and authenticated. Witness statements were cross-referenced. The prosecution prepared a petition for transfer to adult court, arguing that the nature of the offense, the evidence of premeditation, and the vulnerability of the victims warranted adjudication outside the juvenile system. The defense prepared to resist, citing Chloe's age, her traumatic background, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Both sides knew the transfer hearing would be the case's first major battlefield, and the moment where the legal system would publicly declare whether it saw Chloe as a child who needed help or an offender who demanded accountability. The answer would shape everything that followed. Outside the courthouse, someone had placed a small arrangement of flowers near the building's entrance. No card, no name, just white carnations in a mason jar, left on the stone step like a quiet petition for the dead. No one claimed them. No one removed them. They sat there through the transfer hearing preparations, through the pre-trial motions, through the arguments that filled conference rooms and legal pads wilting slowly in the sun. They were still there, brown and dry, the morning the hearing began. A reminder, accidental but permanent, that at the center of every legal argument were two people who would never come home. And a house on Miller Lane where the porch light had finally been turned off. The town didn't just lose two people. It lost the belief that kindness was enough. The transfer hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and floor cleaner. The room was built for modest proceedings, traffic disputes, and property arguments, not for the question it was now being asked to answer. Should a 13-year-old be tried as an adult for double homicide? The gallery filled early. Relatives of the Whitfields sat in the front row with the specific posture of people who are holding themselves together through force of will. Behind them, community members, reporters, and a few law students who had driven from the state university to observe. The judge, a man named Robert Langford, had served on the bench for 22 years and carried the composed bearing of someone who had seen enough to know that courts exist precisely for the cases no one wants to face. Chloe entered in clean clothes, hair brushed, expression carefully neutral. She was smaller than the chair, a visual that the defense intended the judge to notice. Her attorney, a public defender named Claire Tran, had prepared a strategy built on 3 pillars: Chloe's age, her traumatic childhood, and the juvenile system's capacity for rehabilitation. Tran argued that the juvenile court was designed for exactly this scenario, a young offender whose behavior was rooted in environmental damage, not irredeemable character. She presented reports from a psychologist who had evaluated Chloe and described attachment disruption, emotional dysregulation, and a capacity for change given appropriate long-term intervention. The argument was compassionate, grounded, and legally sound. It was also facing a wall of evidence. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb, a man who spoke the way Richard Whitfield worked, slowly, precisely, without waste. Webb did not argue that Chloe was evil. He argued that the crime was adult in every measurable dimension. He walked the judge through the evidence in chronological order. The weeks of planning documented in the notebook, the purchase of medication, the research into forensic countermeasures, the sedation of both victims, the concealment of evidence, and the construction of a false narrative maintained through multiple interviews. Webb's voice remained level as he described each element, which made the content land harder. And he concluded with a sentence that compressed the prosecution's entire philosophy into a single breath. He said, "This was not a child's mistake. This was a child's operation." Judge Langford asked questions of both sides with the methodical care of someone who understood that his decision would be scrutinized, regardless of which direction it went. He asked the psychologist whether Chloe's planning capacity was consistent with juvenile impulsivity. The psychologist hesitated before acknowledging that the duration and sophistication of the planning exceeded typical adolescent reactive behavior. He asked the defense whether the juvenile system could guarantee public safety given the nature of the offense. Tran argued that rehabilitation was possible but could not offer guarantees, because no system can. He asked the prosecution whether adult sentencing constraints would account for Chloe's age. Webb cited recent legal precedents requiring courts to consider youth at sentencing even in adult proceedings. The exchange was civil, precise, and heavy with the weight of its implications. During the hearing, Chloe displayed behavior that the gallery watched with fascinated unease. She doodled on a notepad. She whispered to her attorney with what appeared to be impatience. When the psychologist described her childhood trauma, she looked not moved, but annoyed, as though her own suffering was being used without her permission. When the prosecutor described the notebook entries, she shifted in her chair and sighed audibly. Judge Langford glanced at her once, briefly. with an expression that conveyed neither sympathy nor hostility, but a kind of measured attention, the look of a man evaluating what he sees against what he has been told. The gallery noticed the sigh. In a room where two murdered grandparents were being discussed, a sigh from the accused lands like a dropped glass in a silent church. Judge Langford took 4 days to issue his ruling. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. He began by acknowledging the profound difficulty of the decision, the tension between protecting a child's developmental potential and recognizing the gravity of premeditated violence against vulnerable victims. He cited relevant case law extensively, demonstrating that his decision rested on legal foundation rather than emotion. Then he delivered the ruling. The case would be transferred to adult court. His reasoning centered on the evidence of sustained planning, the deliberate targeting of defenseless victims, and the post-offense behavior indicating awareness of wrongdoing and active concealment. He emphasized that this did not mean the court viewed Chloe as beyond redemption. It meant the court viewed the offense as beyond the juvenile system's capacity to address adequately. Chloe's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something that made Tran close her eyes briefly. Then Chloe turned to face the gallery, and for one suspended moment, the courtroom saw the expression that would later define media coverage of the case. Not fear, not sadness, but irritation. When the irritation of someone whose plan has encountered an unexpected obstacle. It lasted only seconds before she composed herself. But those seconds were captured by a courtroom sketch artist whose rendering would appear in newspapers across the state. The drawing showed a girl who looked exactly her age and nothing like her age at the same time. Outside, the carnations on the courthouse step had been replaced by a fresh bouquet. Someone was still remembering. The judge didn't see a little girl. He saw a long plan. In the months between the transfer ruling and the trial, Chloe remained in a juvenile detention facility, separated from the general population for her safety and the safety of others. Staff interactions during this period would become part of the trial record, not as formal evidence of guilt, but as context for sentencing. The reports painted a portrait that was both clinical and deeply unsettling. Chloe adapted to the facility with a speed that surprised even experienced staff. She learned the rules within days, identified which staff members were lenient and which were firm, and adjusted her behavior accordingly. She was, by institutional standards, a model resident. She completed schoolwork, attended sessions with the facility psychologist, and avoided conflict. But the psychologist's notes told a different story beneath the compliance. The psychologist, Dr. Renata Voss, conducted 12 sessions with Chloe over a 3-month period. Her evaluation would become one of the most discussed documents in the case. Dr. Voss described Chloe as possessing above-average intelligence, strong verbal skills, and an unusual capacity for emotional mimicry. The ability to produce the appearance of feelings without the internal experience that typically accompanies them. Chloe could cry on cue during sessions when discussing her childhood, but the crying stopped abruptly when the topic changed, like a faucet turning off. She could express remorse in words that sounded textbook appropriate, but when Dr. Voss probed for specificity, asking Chloe to describe what she missed about her grandparents, what memories made her sad, the answers became generic and hollow. She missed their cooking. She missed the house. She missed normal life. She never described a moment, a conversation, or a feeling tied to a specific human connection. Dr. Voss was careful not to diagnose Chloe with any specific personality disorder, noting that personality assessment in adolescence is inherently limited because the personality is still forming. However, she identified traits that warranted serious concern: a persistent pattern of manipulative behavior, a marked absence of genuine empathy, and a tendency to view relationships as transactional rather than emotional. Chloe spoke about her grandparents' deaths with the same emotional register she used to describe changing schools. She spoke about her mother's absence with a shrug that carried no visible weight. The only topic that consistently produced genuine effect was her own situation, her own confinement, her own future. When discussing the possibility of a long sentence, Chloe's eyes sharpened, her voice tightened, and her words became more urgent. Her own freedom was the only subject that touched something real. The defense used Dr. Voss's report selectively, highlighting the sections on Chloe's traumatic background and the malleability of adolescent personality. They argued that the very traits Dr. Voss identified, the mimicry, the transactional thinking, the emotional flatness, were products of early neglect, not innate character. A child who learns in infancy that crying produces no comfort eventually stops crying with authenticity. A child who is moved between homes learns to read people for survival, not for connection. The argument was psychologically sound and emotionally compelling. It asked the jury to see Chloe not as a cold operator, but as a broken system responding to broken inputs. The challenge for the defense was that the jury would also have to see the notebook, the search history, and the timeline. Sympathy for a damaged child is powerful. It is not always powerful enough to overwrite a plan documented in handwriting. The prosecution retained its own expert, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Alan Hart, who reviewed the same materials and reached complementary but differently emphasized conclusions. Dr. Hart acknowledged Chloe's difficult background, but focused on what he called choice point analysis, the moments within the planning phase where Chloe had the opportunity to stop and didn't. She could have stopped after the first search. She could have stopped after buying the medication. She could have stopped after writing the first notebook entry. She could have stopped any night before the night she chose. Each choice point represented a moment where the developing brain, however impaired, still processed options and selected the harmful one. Dr. Hart's testimony would argue that while childhood trauma explains context, it does not extinguish agency. Explanation and excuse live in the same neighborhood but are not the same address. In the facility, one incident captured the essential paradox of Chloe's presentation. A younger resident, a girl of 11, was crying in the common area after a family visit. Staff watched as Chloe approached, sat beside the girl, and spoke to her softly for several minutes. The girl calmed down. Staff noted the interaction as a positive social behavior. But later that evening, Chloe told a staff member, almost casually, that she had comforted the girl because she noticed staff were watching and she wanted to be documented as showing empathy. The candor was startling. She wasn't confessing manipulation with guilt. She was describing strategy with pride. The staff member reported the comment. It entered the file. And it sat there like a small, cold stone at the center of every argument about whether Chloe Whitfield was capable of change or merely capable of performing it. As the trial date approached, public interest in the case intensified. Local news had expanded to state coverage, and several national outlets began following the proceedings. The narrative that emerged in media was bifurcated. One version portrayed Chloe as a victim of systemic failure, a child the system should have saved before she became a killer. The other version portrayed her as a calculating predator whose youth made her more frightening, not less. Both narratives were partially true and wholly incomplete, which is the nature of true crime when it involves a child. People wanted a single story, a clean moral. The case refused to provide one. It offered instead a 13-year-old girl who had been failed, and who had, in turn, failed everyone. The question was not whether both things were true. The question was what the law does when both things are true at the same time. She could perform every emotion except the one that mattered. The trial opened on a gray morning with the courtroom filled to capacity and an overflow room set up with a closed-circuit feed for those who couldn't find seats inside. Judge Langford had been reassigned to preside, a decision that carried both logistical logic and symbolic weight. He knew the case, he knew the arguments, and he had already demonstrated that he could hold the line between compassion and accountability, which this trial would test every single day. Jury selection had been exhaustive, lasting over a week, as attorneys on both sides tried to seat 12 people who could look at a 13-year-old defendant and still follow evidence wherever it led. The final jury was composed of 8 women and 4 men, ages ranging from 26 to 64, none of whom had children at Chloe's school, all of whom had sworn they could be impartial. Impartiality in a case like this is not a feeling. It is a discipline. Prosecutor Marcus Webb delivered his opening statement with the restraint that had become his signature. He did not use emotional language. He did not describe the crime in graphic terms. He described a sequence. A girl living in her grandparents' home, weeks of documented planning, a purchase of sedatives, a night of execution, a morning of deception. He told the jury that the case was not about whether Chloe had a difficult childhood. It was about whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that she planned and carried out the deaths of Richard and Margaret Whitfield. He asked the jury to follow the evidence, not their instincts, because instincts would tell them a child cannot do this. The evidence would tell them this child did. He concluded with a sentence that would be quoted in every subsequent article about the case. He said, "She used their trust as her weapon and their routine as her blueprint." Claire Tran's opening was longer, warmer, and deliberately personal. She described Chloe's childhood in detail, the absent mother, the unstable homes, the neglect that predated any criminal behavior. She described a girl who arrived at her grandparents' home already damaged, already unable to form the attachments that protect children from their own worst impulses. Tran acknowledged the evidence. She did not deny that Chloe was present, that Chloe had researched, that Chloe had acted. But she asked the jury to see the why beneath the what. She said Chloe was not a monster. She was a product of failures so numerous that listing them would take longer than the trial itself. The defense strategy was clear: not acquittal, but mitigation; not innocence, but context. Tran wanted the jury to convict, if they must, with a heavy heart rather than a clenched fist. The distinction would matter at sentencing. The prosecution's first witnesses were procedural but effective. Officer Beth Calder described the welfare check, the open door, the girl who looked interested rather than grief-stricken. The crime scene technician walked the jury through photographs of the home, pointing out the absence of forced entry, the staged quality of the kitchen knife, the undisturbed bedroom that concealed violence beneath a veneer of peace. The medical examiner testified about sedation and cause of death with clinical precision, pausing only when asked to clarify the vulnerability of the victims, both elderly, both asleep, both chemically incapacitated, before any harm was done. The jury listened with the focused stillness of people absorbing information they will carry for years. One juror, a woman in her 50s, closed her eyes briefly during the medical testimony. She didn't look away from weakness. She looked away because understanding required a moment of darkness. Detective Sandra Morales took the stand on the second day and walked the jury through the investigation methodically. She described the digital evidence, the phone activity, the thermostat log, the recovered search history, and the notebook. When she read aloud the entry that said after the milk but before the lamp, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the ventilation system hummed like a choir. Chloe, at the defense table, looked down at her hands. It was the most subdued she had appeared throughout the proceedings. Whether the response was genuine discomfort or tactical awareness that the jury was watching, no one could say. That ambiguity was the case's emotional core. The impossibility of knowing what a 13-year-old truly feels when her own words are read back to her like an indictment written in her own hand. Cross-examination by Tran was precise and respectful. She did not attack Morales's credibility, but probed the margins of interpretation. Could the thermostat change have been accidental? Morales conceded it was possible, but unlikely given the pattern. Could the notebook entries be creative writing? Morales acknowledged the theoretical possibility while noting the entries' correlation with real events. Could the phone activity be automated? The digital analyst, recalled briefly, explained that the specific pattern of screen activations was consistent with manual interaction. Tran scored small points but could not crack the cumulative weight. Each piece of evidence, individually, might carry an alternative explanation. Together they formed a current that flowed in one direction, and the jury could feel the current. At the end of the third day, as the courtroom emptied slowly and the rain outside resumed its gray rhythm, a relative of the Whitfields paused in the hallway near a window. She held a photograph of Margaret, wallet-sized, the kind grandmothers give to grandchildren and carry in their purses. She looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it back into her pocket and walked to the elevator. The photograph had been taken at a church picnic 2 years earlier. Margaret was smiling. The sun was behind her. She looked like someone who believed the world was, on balance, kind. That belief had cost her everything. And in the courtroom behind the closed doors, the evidence continued assembling itself into the shape of a verdict that no photograph could soften. The evidence didn't argue. It accumulated. The fourth day of trial belonged to the forensic evidence, the kind of testimony that doesn't raise voices but raises certainty. The state's digital forensics analyst returned to the stand with visual aids that translated technical data into a language jurors could follow. Screen by screen, she showed the recovered search history, dates, times, queries. The jury watched as weeks of research materialized on a courtroom monitor, each search a stepping stone from curiosity to commitment. The analyst explained cloud backups, deletion recovery, and timestamp authentication in terms that made complex technology feel as reliable as a clock. She testified that Chloe's device had generated the searches, and that the user account was logged in, and that the pattern of activity was consistent with a single user operating over an extended period. Defense challenged on access and account security. The analyst conceded that account compromise was theoretically possible, but presented no evidence supporting that theory. The absence of the alternative was, in its own way, evidence. The pharmacy footage was shown next. The screen displayed a grainy but recognizable figure entering the store, moving directly to the sleep aid aisle, selecting a product, and paying with cash at a self-checkout terminal. The figure's height, build, and clothing were consistent with Chloe. The timestamp was consistent with a school day when Chloe had been marked absent during the afternoon. The prosecution introduced the school attendance record alongside the footage. Present in the morning, absent after lunch, and that evening a full bottle of sleep medication entered the Whitfield home in a backpack. The defense argued the footage quality was insufficient for positive identification. The prosecution responded that identification didn't rest on the footage alone. It rested on the footage, plus the absence record, plus the medication found in the home, plus the notebook entries detailing the plan to administer it. Each piece was a thread. Together, they were a net. The notebook itself was entered as an exhibit, and pages were projected for the jury. The handwriting was confirmed as Chloe's through comparison analysis. The jury read the entries in silence, following the prosecutor's guided narration through the routine observations, the timing notes, and the clinical language of preparation. One juror visibly swallowed when the entry about the milk was projected. Another adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, as if the words might change on closer inspection. They didn't. They sat on the screen with the immovable patience of ink on paper, saying exactly what they had always said. The defense did not attempt to exclude the notebook. Instead, Tran argued interpretation. The entries could reflect fantasy, journaling, a disturbed child's way of processing anger without intent to act. The prosecution's rebuttal was the timeline. The notebook entries preceded the purchase preceded the crime. Fantasy doesn't buy medication. Forensic results from the utility knife were presented by the lab technician who had processed it. Biological material consistent with both victims was recovered despite the attempted cleaning. The partial fingerprint on the handle was displayed alongside Chloe's known prints, and the examiner explained the points of similarity with visual overlays. The defense's expert, brought in for cross-examination, challenged the fingerprint comparison on the basis of partial recovery and age-related print variability. It was a legitimate challenge, and the defense scored a technical point. But the prosecution had prepared for this. They didn't need the fingerprint to stand alone. They needed it to stand beside the knife's location, the traces, the notebook, and the timeline. The jury didn't need to be convinced by one item. They needed to be unable to explain away all of them. And with each exhibit, that task grew harder. The alarm system and thermostat data were presented in tandem, showing a timeline of household activity during the critical overnight hours. The prosecution displayed the data as a simple visual timeline on the courtroom screen. Alarm events, thermostat changes, and phone activations plotted on a single axis. The convergence was striking. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, the house was not asleep. Someone was moving, adjusting, operating within it. Chloe's story required that she was unconscious during this window. The data required that she was not. The disconnect was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of physics. A phone cannot activate itself in a pattern consistent with human checking. A thermostat cannot adjust itself to a user's preset. An alarm panel cannot log a valid code without someone entering it. Machines are indifferent witnesses. They record what happens, not what the defendant wishes had happened. The prosecution rested after 5 days of testimony. The evidence had been presented without theatrics, without emotional manipulation, and without a single raised voice. Webb's strategy had been architectural. Build the case like a structure where every beam supports the next, so that removing one doesn't collapse the whole. He had succeeded. The jury had watched a quiet, relentless accumulation of facts that pointed in a single direction. There were no surprise witnesses, no dramatic revelations. There was only the methodical exposure of what had happened, documented by machines and molecules that had no opinion about the outcome. The defense would now present its case, and the courtroom prepared to hear the other side of a story that had, so far, been told entirely by objects that could not be cross-examined into doubt. Chloe sat through the prosecution's case with varying degrees of composure. On some days she appeared bored, doodling on her notepad while crime scene photographs were displayed. On other days she seemed agitated, whispering urgently to Tran or shifting in her seat during testimony she found threatening. Once, during the medical examiner's testimony about Margaret's vulnerability, Chloe smiled faintly. The smile was brief, possibly involuntary, possibly meaningless. But a juror saw it, and a journalist in the gallery saw the juror see it. That micro moment, lasting perhaps half a second, would be described in every major article about the trial. Because in a case defined by composure and control, the unguarded moments are the ones that tell the truth. A smile during testimony about a grandmother's death is not evidence of guilt, but it is evidence of something, and the jury would carry it into deliberation like a splinter they could not remove. The machines remembered what she tried to make them forget. The defense case opened with Dr. Renata Voss, whose testimony attempted to reframe Chloe not as a calculating predator, but as a profoundly damaged child whose early experiences had distorted her capacity for empathy, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Dr. Voss described the neurological effects of early neglect on the developing brain, using language accessible enough for a jury to grasp and scientific enough to carry weight. She explained that children raised in chaotic, attachment-deprived environments often develop survival strategies that mimic calculated behavior but are actually adaptations to unpredictability. They learned to read situations, suppress emotions, and act strategically because their survival depended on it. In Chloe's case, Voss argued, the planning that looked like premeditation was, in a developmental sense, an extension of the hypervigilance she had learned as a small child, navigating her mother's addiction. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Voss was respectful but incisive. Webb asked whether early trauma removed the capacity to distinguish right from wrong. Dr. Voss said it did not remove it, but could impair it. Webb asked whether Chloe's notebook entries, the ones that documented routines and timing with clear strategic purpose, were consistent with impaired moral reasoning or with intact reasoning applied toward a harmful goal. Dr. Voss paused before answering, acknowledging that the entries reflected a level of organized thinking that suggested awareness of consequences. Webb asked one final question. Does trauma explain the plan, or does it explain why the plan was possible? Dr. Voss said both. Webb said no further questions, and the jury was left to sit with the distinction, which was the point. The prosecution wasn't arguing that Chloe's childhood was fine. It was arguing that understanding why she did it doesn't change that she chose to do it. Claire Tran called a social worker who had been involved with Chloe's family during earlier custody proceedings. The social worker described a system that had failed at multiple points: caseworkers overwhelmed with caseloads, foster placements that lasted weeks instead of months, a mother who received treatment referrals but little follow-up, and a child who fell through cracks so numerous they resembled a net with no mesh. The testimony was damning not to Chloe, but to the infrastructure that was supposed to protect her. Tran used it to build the narrative that Chloe was not born this way. She was made this way. The jury listened with the specific discomfort that arises when a legal proceeding reveals systemic failure, because systemic failure implicates everyone and absolves no one, and it doesn't bring back the Whitfields. Tran also presented Chloe's school records showing average performance, no disciplinary actions, and teacher comments that ranged from pleasant to quiet to needs encouragement. The records painted a picture of institutional anonymity, a child who moved through school the way she moved through everything, unnoticed and undisturbed. Tran argued that these records showed a girl who was not inherently violent, who had no history of aggression, and whose crime was an aberration born from specific, extraordinary psychological pressure. The prosecution countered during cross that the absence of prior violence did not preclude planned violence, and that many first-time offenders commit serious crimes without a prior record. The exchange was civil but pointed, and it crystallized the trial's central tension. Does the past explain the present? And if it does, how much does explanation matter when two people are dead? The defense rested without calling Chloe to testify. The decision was strategic and significant. Tran knew that Chloe's flat affect, her tendency toward dismissive comments, and her inability to produce convincing remorse would devastate her in front of a jury. The risk of cross-examination was too high. Webb would have asked Chloe about the notebook, the searches, the messages, and the smile. Chloe would have had to answer with the same jury watching her face for authenticity. The defense could not control what Chloe's face would do, so they kept her silent, which was its own kind of message. The jury noticed the absence. They would discuss it during deliberation, not as evidence of guilt, since a defendant has the right not to testify, but as a human observation they could not unsee. While the empty witness chair spoke loudly in its quiet way. Closing arguments arrived like the final act of a play whose ending the audience already suspects, but needs to hear spoken aloud. Webb stood and walked the jury through the evidence one last time, not in summary, but in sequence, showing how each piece connected to the next in an unbroken chain from planning to execution to concealment. He ended not with anger, but with a request for precision. He said, "This case asks you to do something difficult. It asks you to look at a child and see the truth. Not the truth you wish were real, but the truth that the evidence proves. The notebook is her handwriting. The searches are her device. The medication is in the home she lived in. The alarm code is hers. The phone was in her hand. I and Richard and Margaret Whitfield are not here because of what happened in that house on the night those systems recorded her presence and her actions. Tran closed with emotion that felt genuine because it likely was. She did not deny the evidence. She asked the jury to weigh it against context. She described Chloe at 5, at 8, at 11, each age a chapter of loss and neglect that accumulated into the distorted worldview capable of producing this crime. She asked whether justice required understanding or only punishment. She asked whether the jury could find guilt and still feel grief for the defendant. She said that convicting Chloe might be unavoidable, but the manner in which they held that conviction, with mercy or with iron, would define not just Chloe's future, but the kind of justice system they believed in. It was a powerful closing. Whether it was powerful enough remained the jury's decision. The defense couldn't change the evidence. It tried to change the lens. Judge Langford delivered his instructions to the jury with the deliberate clarity of a man who understood that every word he spoke would be examined on appeal. He explained the charges, the elements of each offense, the standard of proof, and the obligation to consider only the evidence presented in court. He reminded the jurors that sympathy, whether for the victims or the defendant, was not a legal standard. He told them that reasonable doubt was not any doubt, but doubt grounded in reason and evidence. He told them their job was not to solve the mystery of Chloe Whitfield's psychology, but to answer the narrow question of whether she committed the acts described in the charges. Then he released them to deliberate, and the courtroom exhaled into a tension that settled like weather. Deliberation lasted 2 days. The length was neither surprising nor alarming. 2 days for a double homicide involving a minor defendant suggested the jury was careful, which is what both sides wanted, even if both sides were terrified. Inside the jury room, the contents of the discussion remained sealed, but later interviews with jurors conducted after the verdict revealed a group wrestling with exactly the tension the trial had produced. The evidence was clear. The discomfort was enormous. Several jurors described the experience as the hardest thing they had ever done, not because they doubted the facts, but because applying facts to a 13-year-old felt like a violation of something they couldn't name. One juror said she kept looking at the projected image of the notebook and wishing the handwriting belonged to someone older. It didn't, and wishing didn't change it. When the jury returned, the courtroom reassembled with the charged anticipation of a room about to hear something irreversible. Chloe sat upright, jaw set, eyes forward. Tran placed a hand on the table near Chloe's arm, not touching, just present. Webb sat still, folder closed, pen down. The gallery held its breath in a collective suspension that made the room feel pressurized. Judge Langford asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a man in his 40s with a voice that shook despite his effort to control it, said yes. He read the verdict on the first count. Guilty. A sound moved through the gallery, not a gasp, but a low exhalation, and the sound of something heavy being set down. The second count. Guilty. The sound came again, quieter this time, as if the room were learning how to absorb the word. Chloe's reaction was observed by every person in the courtroom and would be described in dozens of articles, podcasts, and legal analyses in the months that followed. She did not cry. She did not collapse. Her face performed a sequence of micro-expressions that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Surprise, then tightness, then something that looked very much like contempt before settling into the blank mask she had worn for most of the proceedings. She turned to Tran and said something inaudible. Tran nodded. Chloe turned back to face the judge, and in the brief moment before she composed herself fully, the gallery saw it again. The smile, not wide, not joyful, but present. a reflexive curl at the corner of her mouth, as though something inside her found the moment absurd rather than devastating. It vanished quickly, but it had been seen. And in a trial defined by what a girl's face revealed and concealed, that final involuntary expression became the image the public would remember longest. Judge Langford polled the jury individually. Each juror confirmed the verdict. Several looked at Chloe as they spoke. One looked at the floor. The formality was necessary and terrible in equal measure, 12 voices saying the same word 12 times, building a consensus that could not be retracted. When the polling was complete, Langford thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for presentence reports, victim impact statements, and the psychological evaluations that would inform the final determination. He remanded Chloe to custody. She stood when told to stand. She walked when told to walk. And as she passed the gallery, she looked straight ahead, chin level, as though the verdict were an inconvenience rather than a conclusion. Behind her, in the front row, a woman clutching a photograph of Margaret Whitfield finally allowed herself to weep. Outside the courthouse, the reaction split along the same lines that had divided the community since the arrest. Some people felt relief, the grim satisfaction of a system that functioned despite the horror of what it processed. Others felt anguish, the sense that convicting a 13-year-old of adult crimes represented a failure so deep it couldn't be located in any single person or institution. Reporters asked relatives for comments. Most declined. One aunt, standing near the courthouse steps where the carnations had been replaced yet again with fresh flowers, said only this: "Nothing is fixed. They are still gone." And she is still 13. The comment resisted easy interpretation, which is why it was quoted more than any other. It held grief and acknowledgement and futility in a single breath. It sounded like the truth usually sounds, incomplete and irreducible. The trial was over. The sentencing was not. And in the intervening weeks, the case would face its most difficult question yet, not what happened, which had been answered, and not who did it, which had been proven, but what now? What does a society do with a child who has been convicted of the worst thing a person can do? What does justice look like when the defendant still has baby teeth in a jar at her grandmother's house? The answer would come from Judge Langford, and the answer would make history. Not because it was unprecedented in its severity, not because it was unprecedented in its mercy, but because it tried, in its imperfect and human way, to be both. 12 voices said the same word. The word was final. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks after the verdict, and the courtroom carried a different energy than it had during the trial. The trial had been about facts. Sentencing was about meaning. The gallery was full again, but the faces had changed. There were fewer reporters and more community members, people who had come not for information but for closure, or whatever version of closure a courtroom can provide. The front row held the same relatives who had attended every day, now carrying not photographs, but written statements. Behind them sat former students of Richard, volunteers from Margaret's Pantry, neighbors from Miller Lane. They had come to speak or to listen to those who would, because sentencing is the moment when the law acknowledges what numbers and exhibits cannot express: the human cost of what was lost. The victim impact statements began with Margaret's sister, a woman named Dorothy, who was 71 and had never spoken publicly about anything in her life. She stood at the podium with a single sheet of paper that trembled in her hands and read a statement that would be quoted in legal journals for years. She described Margaret as a person who believed the best about everyone, including Chloe. She described Richard as the kind of man who fixed things because he believed everything broken could be mended. Then she said the sentence that silenced the courtroom so completely that the court reporter's fingers paused above the keys. She said, "Margaret would have forgiven you. That is why you were able to do what you did." The words were not an accusation. They were a diagnosis. They named the precise mechanism of the betrayal. Trust weaponized against the trusting. Dorothy returned to her seat without looking at Chloe. She didn't need to. The words had already arrived where they needed to go. A neighbor spoke next, briefly, about the hole the Whitfields left in the community's daily life. He described the flag that no longer rose at dawn, the garden that had gone to weeds, the pantry that operated with fewer hands. He described the feeling of walking past the house and knowing what happened inside it, how the knowledge changed the air on the street, how children now walked faster past it, how the porch light had been disconnected. He said the house was still standing, but it wasn't a home anymore. It was a monument to something no one wanted to remember, and no one could forget. His statement lasted less than 3 minutes. He returned to his seat and folded his hands in his lap, and the courtroom gave him the only gift it could, which was silence held with respect. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation was measured and precise. Webb argued for a sentence that reflected the gravity of 2 premeditated homicides committed against vulnerable, trusting victims in their own home. He acknowledged Chloe's age and cited the constitutional requirement that sentencing of minors must consider youth-related factors, including capacity for rehabilitation. He did not ask for a sentence without the possibility of eventual review. He asked for a sentence that took the crime seriously, that honored the victims, and that placed the burden of demonstrating genuine change on the defendant before any release could be considered. He said accountability is not cruelty. It is the boundary that protects the living. He said it quietly, looking not at Chloe but at the jury box where the jurors no longer sat, as though addressing the principle rather than the person. Claire Tran's sentencing argument was the most emotional presentation of the entire case. She described Chloe's life from birth to arrest as a cascade of failures. A mother lost to addiction, a father never present, homes that shifted like sand, a child who learned that love was conditional and temporary. She argued that the juvenile brain is not the adult brain, that neuroscience supports the possibility of profound change in adolescence, and that sentencing a 13-year-old to decades of incarceration without meaningful opportunity for review is a declaration that redemption is impossible. She asked Judge Langford to impose a sentence that punished appropriately but preserved a pathway, however narrow, for Chloe to demonstrate that the damaged child who committed this crime is not the final version of the person she might become. Tran's voice cracked once near the end when she said the word might, and the crack was more persuasive than any statistic. Chloe was offered the opportunity to address the court. She stood. She held a piece of paper. The courtroom watched with the hyper-attention that only allocution can produce, because this was the moment the defendant's own words would either support or undermine everything said on her behalf. Chloe read from the paper in a voice that was steady and clear. She said she was sorry for the pain that had been caused. She said she wished things had been different. She said she understood that what happened could not be undone. She did not say Richard's name. She did not say Margaret's name. She did not describe a single memory of them. She did not cry. Her apology circled the facts like a bird that never lands, touching proximity to remorse without ever committing to its surface. When she finished, she sat down and placed her hands flat on the table. The courtroom weighed her words against her face and found the balance wanting. Apology without names is architecture without foundation. It stands, but it holds nothing. Judge Langford took 17 minutes to deliver his sentencing statement, and in those 17 minutes, he built a framework that legal scholars would debate and reference for years. He acknowledged every mitigating factor the defense had raised: Chloe's age, her traumatic history, the developing adolescent brain, and the constitutional mandate to treat juvenile offenders differently from adults. Then he turned to the aggravating factors: the sustained premeditation evidenced by weeks of planning, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims who had opened their home to the defendant, the sedation that rendered the victims helpless, the post-crime concealment, and the absence of demonstrated remorse throughout the proceedings. He said youth explains vulnerability, but it does not erase deliberation. He said the court's obligation was to balance the defendant's potential for growth against the irreversible harm inflicted on two people who could not speak for themselves. Then he imposed the sentence. 2 life terms with the possibility of parole review only after a minimum of 35 years, to be served consecutively with mandatory participation in rehabilitative programming and periodic psychological evaluation. The sentence meant that Chloe would not be eligible for her first parole hearing until she was nearly 50 years old. It was not the maximum. It was not the minimum. It was a door left slightly ajar at the end of a very long hallway. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, as though the wood understood what it was punctuating. Chloe's face tightened. The smile did not appear. For the first time in the entire proceedings, she looked not angry, not bored, not contemptuous, but genuinely stunned, as if the distance between her expectations and reality had finally become visible to her. She was led from the courtroom without turning around. The gallery rose slowly, the way people rise from chairs in hospitals, with the careful deliberation of those who are not sure their legs will hold. Dorothy walked out holding the photograph of Margaret against her chest. The neighbor who had spoken about the flag walked out looking at the floor. Outside, the April air was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Someone had placed a new jar of white carnations on the courthouse steps. They were fresh. They would outlast the news cycle. They would wilt and be replaced and wilt again, a quiet ritual of remembrance performed by someone who never identified themselves, as if naming the grief would make it smaller when the only appropriate response was to let it remain as large as it was. In the weeks and months that followed, the case settled into the community like sediment in still water, present but no longer agitated. The Whitfield house was eventually sold to a young family who repainted it and planted new flowers along the walkway. Richard's workshop was cleared out, his tools donated to the school shop program he had supported for decades. Margaret's pantry friends continued their Tuesday shifts with a framed photograph of her on the shelf beside the canned goods. Chloe's name faded from daily conversation, but never fully disappeared, invoked whenever the town discussed children or trust or the limits of what love can prevent. The case left 2 questions that no verdict could answer and no sentence could retire. The first was whether justice had been served or merely approximated, whether any number of years could represent the weight of 2 lives taken by the person those lives had tried to save. The second was whether Chloe, decades from now, might emerge from incarceration genuinely changed, genuinely remorseful, genuinely human, in the way she had never been allowed or never chosen to be. Those questions would remain open, patient as evidence, are waiting like the carnations on the courthouse steps for an answer that might never come. And in the silence after the gavel, in the space where the story ends and the meaning begins, the only certainty was this. Richard raised the flag every morning because he believed in something worth protecting. Margaret opened her door because she believed in something worth saving. They were right about the world. They were wrong about the danger. And the 13-year-old girl who smiled during her trial learned in the end that a smile is not a shield. It is just a shape the mouth makes when the heart has nothing left to say. The smirk didn't survive the gavel. 3 months after sentencing, Chloe Whitfield's defense team filed a notice of appeal. The grounds were predictable and procedurally necessary. They challenged the transfer to adult court, argued that the sentence violated constitutional protections against disproportionate punishment for juvenile offenders, and contested the admissibility of the notebook on the basis that it constituted private journaling that should have been protected under a broader interpretation of personal expression. Claire Tran, who remained on the case through the appellate phase, filed the briefs with the quiet professionalism of someone fulfilling an obligation she believed in even when the odds were steep. The appeal was not frivolous. It raised legitimate questions about juvenile sentencing in a legal landscape that had been evolving rapidly since landmark rulings required courts to treat children differently than adults. But legitimate questions and winning arguments are not always the same thing. The appellate court reviewed the record with the granular attention that high-profile juvenile cases demand. 3 judges examined the transfer hearing transcript, the trial evidence, the sentencing statement, and the constitutional framework that governed the intersection of youth and serious crime. They considered whether Judge Langford had properly weighed the mitigating factors of Chloe's age and background. They considered whether the sentence, while lengthy, preserved the meaningful opportunity for release that the law required. They considered whether the notebook seizure from a school locker, executed under a valid warrant with school administration consent, violated any expectation of privacy that a student might reasonably hold. Each issue was addressed in a written opinion that ran 47 pages, dense with case citations and careful reasoning, the kind of document that reads like a conversation between the law and its own conscience. The appellate court affirmed the conviction and the sentence on all grounds. The opinion acknowledged the tragedy of sentencing a child to decades of incarceration, but concluded that the trial court had properly considered every required factor. The transfer was supported by the evidence of sustained premeditation and the severity of the offenses. The sentence, while substantial, included a parole review mechanism that preserved the constitutional requirement of hope. The notebook was lawfully obtained and relevant to the question of intent. The opinion's final paragraph contained a sentence that legal commentators would cite for years. It read, "The law does not ask whether a child can commit an act of this magnitude. The evidence answers that question. The law asks what justice requires when a child does." This court concludes that the trial court answered that question within the boundaries the Constitution provides. Chloe received the news in her facility through her attorney. Staff reported that she listened to Tran's explanation with the same flat expression she had maintained throughout most of the proceedings. She asked one question: what happens now? Tran explained that further appellate options existed, but were unlikely to change the outcome. Chloe nodded, said nothing else, and returned to her routine. The facility psychologist noted in a subsequent session that Chloe did not discuss the appeal result and redirected conversation when it was raised. The psychologist interpreted this as either emotional suppression or genuine indifference, and acknowledged in her notes that distinguishing between the two in Chloe's case remained impossible. The appeal was over. The legal process had reached its functional conclusion, and the girl who had once believed she could control every narrative was now living inside a narrative that no one had asked her to write and no one would allow her to edit. The appeal's failure also marked the moment when Chloe's case transitioned from active legal drama to something more permanent, a precedent. Attorneys in other jurisdictions began citing the Whitfield case in briefs involving juvenile transfer hearings and sentencing arguments. The notebook became a point of discussion in forensic psychology seminars, an example of how documentary evidence of planning can override age-based presumptions of impulsivity. Detective Morales was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the investigation, emphasizing the role of digital forensics and passive recording systems in building cases where no eyewitnesses exist. The case study entered the curriculum of at least 2 criminal justice programs. Chloe Whitfield, who had once fantasized about fame, had achieved a version of it. Her name appeared in footnotes and case indexes, stripped of personality, reduced to a citation. It was a kind of immortality, cold and functional, at the opposite of the legacy Richard and Margaret left behind. In Collinsworth, the appeal's resolution brought a muted sense of finality. People did not celebrate, they acknowledged. The church held a small service of remembrance on the anniversary of the murders, attended by a smaller crowd than the original memorial, but with a deeper, more settled grief. The pantry volunteers placed flowers beside Margaret's photograph and worked their shift in the quiet, focused way that people honor the dead by continuing the work the dead began. Richard's former students organized a scholarship fund in his name, awarded annually to a graduating senior who demonstrated skill and patience in vocational work. The first recipient was a quiet boy who built a rocking chair for his grandmother and delivered it himself. But a detail that would have made Richard smile in the understated way he smiled at things done correctly. The Whitfield house, now repainted and occupied by strangers, settled into the neighborhood's new normal. Children walked past it without speeding up. The flagpole remained, though the new owners flew a different flag. The garden had been replanted with flowers that Margaret would not have recognized but might have appreciated. The street looked like it always had, trim and peaceful, a place that sold itself on safety. But beneath the surface, the memory persisted like groundwater, invisible and permanent. Neighbors who had lived there during the crime still paused sometimes when they heard a siren, still glanced at the house when they passed. Just still carried a splinter of awareness that the world's most dangerous things can grow in its safest places. The appeal looked for an exit. The evidence had sealed every door. In the months following the trial, the Whitfield case became a focal point for experts across multiple disciplines, each examining the same events through different lenses and arriving at conclusions that overlapped but never perfectly aligned. Forensic psychologists debated Chloe's psychological profile in journals and on conference panels. Child development researchers used the case to illustrate the outer edges of adolescent capability. Legal scholars analyzed the sentencing framework and its implications for future juvenile cases. Criminal justice educators dissected the investigation's methodology. The case had become more than a crime. It had become a mirror, reflecting back whatever the observer brought to it, which is what happens when a case is too complex to be reduced to a single moral and too devastating to be left unexamined. The psychological community split along a familiar fault line. One camp argued that Chloe's behavior was best understood through a developmental trauma lens. They cited research showing that children subjected to chronic neglect develop survival mechanisms that can mimic traits associated with more severe personality pathology. In this view, Chloe's emotional flatness, her manipulative tendencies, and her inability to form genuine attachments were not evidence of an inherently disordered character, but rather adaptations to an environment that punished vulnerability and rewarded performance. This camp did not excuse the crime. They argued that understanding its roots was essential to preventing similar outcomes in other damaged children. They pointed to systemic failures, the overwhelmed child welfare agencies, the inadequate foster placements, the mother who received referrals but not follow-through, and asked whether outrage directed at Chloe was misdirected energy that should be aimed at the infrastructure that produced her. The opposing camp, while acknowledging the relevance of Chloe's background, argued that developmental trauma does not adequately explain the sustained, organized nature of the offense. They pointed to the weeks of documented planning, the deliberate acquisition of materials, the strategic exploitation of the victim's routines, and the post-crime concealment behaviors. They argued that these actions reflected not reactive impulsivity driven by trauma, but goal-directed behavior that required ongoing choice. A child acting from pure developmental damage, they suggested, would be more likely to act explosively, not methodically. The notebook, in this view, was not a symptom. It was a blueprint, and blueprints require a designer who understands what they are building. This camp emphasized that acknowledging Chloe's agency did not require denying her suffering. Both could coexist. Both did coexist. The difficulty was that the legal system required a decision, and decisions are binary even when the underlying reality is not. Legal scholars focused on the sentencing structure. Judge Langford's decision to impose life terms with a 35-year minimum before parole eligibility placed the case at the intersection of two competing judicial philosophies. One philosophy held that juvenile offenders, regardless of the severity of their crimes, must be sentenced with a genuine expectation of eventual release because the science of brain development supports the possibility of meaningful change. The other philosophy held that certain offenses are so grave that the sentence must reflect the permanence of the harm, even when the offender is young. Langford's sentence attempted to thread the needle, imposing a consequence severe enough to honor the victims while preserving a parole mechanism that acknowledged Chloe's constitutional right to hope. Whether the needle was threaded successfully depended on who was evaluating. Some scholars praised the balance. Others argued that a minimum of 35 years before, even a hearing functionally eliminated the hope it claimed to preserve. Law enforcement professionals focused on the investigation's technical achievements. The case demonstrated the growing importance of what investigators call passive digital evidence, the data generated by smart home devices, phone sensors, and security cameras that operates independently of any human witness. The thermostat, the alarm panel, the phone screen activations, and the neighbor's garage camera collectively created a timeline that no alibi could survive. Detective Morales, in her conference presentations, emphasized that none of these data points required sophisticated technology. They required warrants, patience, and the understanding that modern homes are, in a forensic sense, always recording. The message for investigators was clear: when there are no eyewitnesses, the house itself may testify. When there are no confessions, the devices may speak. The Whitfield case proved that even a suspect who plans carefully cannot plan for every machine that is quietly watching. The case also prompted discussion in educational circles about the identification of at-risk youth. Chloe had passed through multiple systems, schools, child welfare, courts, and not one had flagged her as dangerous. This was not because professionals were negligent. It was because the warning signs, when they existed, were subtle and easily interpreted as ordinary adolescent behavior. The searches could be curiosity. The notebook could be journaling. The emotional flatness could be introversion. The challenge, as one school psychologist articulated it, is that the same behaviors that signal profound disturbance in retrospect look indistinguishable from normal variation in real time. There is no reliable method for predicting which quiet, withdrawn child is processing trauma and which is planning violence. The admission was uncomfortable but honest, and it pointed toward the only intervention that might make a difference. Not prediction, but investment. More counselors, smaller caseloads, earlier and more sustained support for children in crisis. Systems that don't wait for the crisis to become a crime. The expert analysis, taken as a whole, produced no consensus and no comfort. It produced instead a more complete picture of a case that resisted simplification. Chloe was a victim and a perpetrator. The crime was planned, and the planner was a child. The system failed her, and she destroyed the people who tried to make up for the failure. Every sentence in the case carried its own contradiction. Every conclusion invited its own objection. And the experts, for all their training and credentials, arrived at the same place the community had arrived at months earlier, standing before a question that had no clean answer, holding the weight of it, and knowing that putting it down was not an option. Everyone had a theory. The truth had all of them, and none of them. The facility where Chloe Whitfield served the initial phase of her sentence was a juvenile corrections center designed for serious offenders under 18. It was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no guard towers or razor wire, but it was not a school either. The hallways were clean, the rooms were small, and the doors locked from the outside. Chloe was housed in a unit for residents who required close monitoring, separated from the general population, not because she was at risk from others, but because her profile, the nature of her offense, her age, and her psychological evaluation warranted a level of supervision that the general population setting could not provide. She was assigned a daily schedule: education in the morning, individual counseling twice a week, group therapy once a week, recreation in the afternoon, and evening programming that varied between life skills workshops and structured free time. Chloe adapted to the facility the way she had adapted to every environment she had ever been placed in, quickly, strategically, and without visible emotion. She followed the rules. She attended her sessions. She completed her schoolwork at a level that remained consistent with her pre-incarceration performance, competent but uninspired. Staff described her as cooperative, which in institutional language means she didn't create problems. She didn't start conflicts with other residents. She didn't violate behavioral protocols. She existed within the structure the way she had always existed within structures, by mapping the expectations and meeting them precisely, never exceeding, never falling short, maintaining the exact median that attracts the least attention. Her counseling sessions, documented in quarterly reports, revealed a pattern that would frustrate and fascinate the professionals assigned to her case for years. Chloe could articulate the concepts of empathy, remorse, and responsibility with textbook fluency. She could describe what her crime meant in abstract terms. She could identify the impact on the community and the loss experienced by the victim's relatives. But when pressed for personal specificity, when asked how she felt about what she had done, the responses flattened into generalities. She said she was sorry. She said she wished things were different. She never said she missed Richard. She never said she missed Margaret. The counselors recognized the pattern. It was the same pattern Dr. Voss had identified before the trial. Chloe could perform the language of rehabilitation without inhabiting it. Whether she was incapable of deeper engagement or unwilling to risk it was a question that remained unanswered session after session. One incident during her second year of incarceration provided a small but revealing window into Chloe's interior world. A younger resident in the facility, a girl who had been adjudicated for arson, experienced a severe panic episode during a group session. The girl was crying, hyperventilating, and unable to respond to staff interventions. Chloe, seated nearby, reached over and held the girl's hand without being asked. She said nothing. She simply held on until the episode passed. Staff documented the interaction as a positive behavioral indicator. But in her next individual session, when the counselor asked about the moment, Chloe shrugged and said the girl was loud, and holding her hand was the fastest way to make it stop. The counselor asked if Chloe felt anything during the moment. Chloe considered the question with visible effort, as though accessing a file she rarely opened, and said, "I don't know. Maybe." The honesty of the uncertainty was, paradoxically, the most encouraging thing she had said in months. As Chloe aged within the system, approaching and then passing her 18th birthday, she would be transferred to an adult correctional facility, a transition that loomed with the weight of a second sentencing. The juvenile center, for all its restrictions, maintained a veneer of rehabilitation and development. The adult facility would carry no such pretense. Chloe would enter a world of longer corridors, harder surfaces, and inmates whose histories would dwarf her own in duration, if not in shock. She would carry her file with her, a file that began with 2 counts of first-degree murder and ended with a minimum of 35 years before parole eligibility. In that file, buried beneath the legal documents and psychological evaluations, was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of the notebook entry that read, "After the milk, but before the lamp." It followed her like a shadow, a permanent reminder of the precise moment when planning became irreversible. The years ahead stretched before Chloe like a corridor with one distant window. She would age in increments marked not by birthdays and milestones, but by review dates and evaluations. She would be assessed periodically for progress, for insight, and for the elusive quality that parole boards call genuine remorse, which is different from performed remorse in ways that are felt more than measured. Whether Chloe would ever produce that quality remained the open question that her case would carry into every future hearing. Some professionals believed she could. Some believed the capacity had been destroyed too early, that the years of neglect had closed a door that no amount of programming could reopen. The truth, as always with Chloe, lived in the uncomfortable middle, in the I don't know and the maybe, in the hand that held another girl's hand for reasons that might have been strategic and might have been something else. The walls held her body. Whether they would ever hold her attention was another question entirely. 5 years after the murders, Collinsworth had returned to something resembling its former rhythm, but the resemblance was surface level, the way a repaired bone looks whole on an X-ray, but still aches when the weather changes. The town's routines continued. Children went to school, neighbors waved, the churches filled on Sundays. The gas station sold coffee, and the diner sold gossip, and the seasons turned with the reliable indifference of nature. But beneath the normalcy, the Whitfield case had left a residue that no amount of time or routine could fully dissolve. It lived in the way certain conversations stopped when newcomers entered a room. It lived in the way parents held their children a little tighter after the news, a reflex that faded but never fully released. It lived in the way the town talked about trust, which it still valued but no longer assumed. The Whitfield house had been transformed by its new owners into something unrecognizable to those who remembered it. The porch had been repainted a brighter color. The garden held different plants. The flagpole remained, but the new owners used it for a decorative banner rather than a flag. Richard's workshop had been converted into a playroom. Margaret's kitchen had been renovated with modern appliances and a different color palette. The physical traces of the Whitfields had been erased by the natural process of new occupancy, and yet neighbors who walked past still felt the echo. One longtime resident described it as the feeling you get when you hear a familiar song played in a different key. Everything is technically correct, but something essential has shifted. The house was no longer a crime scene. It was a home again. But it was a home built on a memory that the walls could not forget, even if the paint could cover. Margaret's church pantry had continued operating every Tuesday without interruption, a fact that would have pleased Margaret more than any memorial. The volunteers who had worked alongside her carried her methods forward with the reverence of people preserving a tradition. They stacked cans the way Margaret stacked them. They greeted visitors the way Margaret greeted them. They kept her photograph on the shelf, updated annually with a fresh frame as if she were still a member of the team who simply couldn't make it this week. The pantry became, without anyone formally declaring it, a living memorial, a place where Margaret's values were enacted rather than simply remembered. It was small, unglamorous, and exactly what she would have wanted. Richard's scholarship fund had grown beyond what its founders expected, sustained by annual contributions from former students, community members, and occasional donations from strangers who had read about the case and wanted to do something tangible with their grief. The scholarship was awarded each spring to a graduating senior who demonstrated excellence and dedication in vocational or technical education. The selection committee, composed of teachers and former students of Richard's, evaluated applicants not just on skill, but on character, looking for the patience, precision, and respect for craft that Richard had embodied. Each year, the award ceremony included a brief remembrance of Richard, usually delivered by someone who had sat in his workshop and learned that measuring twice was not just carpentry advice, but life philosophy. The scholarship would not bring Richard back. It would ensure that his way of teaching, his belief that careful work is its own kind of love, continued to shape young hands and young minds. Karen, Chloe's mother, had largely disappeared from public view. Occasional reports placed her in various cities, cycling through the same patterns that had defined her adult life. She did not attend the trial's anniversary observances. She did not participate in media retrospectives. She existed in the case's periphery, a figure whose absence was as defining as her daughter's presence. People in Collinsworth rarely mentioned her, not out of forgiveness, but out of exhaustion. The anger that the community initially directed at Karen for failing Chloe for creating the conditions that produced the crime, had softened into something more like resignation. Blaming Karen didn't bring the Whitfields back. It didn't explain the notebook. It didn't account for the moment when Chloe, regardless of her history, chose to open the cabinet and reach for the bottle. Karen's story was tragic. It was also, in the strictest sense, secondary. The primary story belonged to Richard and Margaret, who had done everything right and paid for it with everything they had. The anonymous person who placed flowers on the courthouse steps continued the practice for years, replacing wilted arrangements with fresh ones at irregular intervals. No one discovered their identity. Theory circulated: a former student of Richard's, a friend of Margaret's, someone who had attended the trial and needed a ritual to process what they had witnessed. The flowers became a quiet landmark, acknowledged by courthouse staff and regular visitors without comment, the way a town acknowledges a church steeple or a particularly old tree. They were there. They were maintained. They meant something. The meaning didn't require explanation, which is perhaps why no one ever asked for one. Some acts of remembrance are strongest when they remain anonymous, when the grief they represent is offered without the expectation of recognition or reciprocity. The flowers were a gift to the dead, delivered in a place where the living had tried, imperfectly, to speak on their behalf. The final trace of the Whitfield case in Collinsworth's daily life was the most subtle and the most enduring. It was the way people talked about their neighbors, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with a slightly deeper attention. When a new family moved onto a street, neighbors introduced themselves a little sooner. When a child seemed withdrawn at school, a teacher mentioned it a little quicker. When someone needed help, the offer came a little faster. The changes were small enough to be invisible and large enough to matter. They were not the result of a policy or a program. They were the result of a town that had learned at tremendous cost that safety is not a feature of geography. It is a practice sustained by attention, renewed by care, and broken only when the people who maintain it look away. Collinsworth had looked away once. The cost was 2 lives and a childhood that became a case file. The town could not undo what happened. It could only carry it forward, the way Margaret carried groceries to the pantry, steadily, faithfully, and with the understanding that some weights are permanent and some burdens are not meant to be set down. The town healed the way bones do, slowly, imperfectly, and with a memory the surface couldn't hide. Every true crime story ends with a verdict, but no true crime story ends with an answer. The Whitfield case delivered its legal conclusions guilty on 2 counts, life sentences with a distant parole window, appellate affirmation, and those conclusions provided the structure of justice that the system is designed to produce. But structure is not meaning. A verdict tells you what happened and who was responsible. It does not tell you why it happened in a way that satisfies the part of the human mind that needs the world to make sense. And the Whitfield case, more than most, resisted the kind of meaning that wraps up neatly and allows the audience to move on. It resisted because its central figure was 13 years old, and 13 is an age that belongs to childhood and adulthood simultaneously, an age that forces every observer to confront the limits of their own moral categories. The question that followed the case out of the courtroom and into public discourse was deceptively simple. What do we do with a child who does something unforgivable? The word child pulls in one direction. The word unforgivable pulls in another. And the tension between them is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be endured, a permanent discomfort that the legal system manages but never resolves. Judge Langford's sentence was an attempt to honor both words, to acknowledge that Chloe was a child and that what she did was unforgivable, and to construct a consequence that held both truths without pretending either one was more real than the other. Whether he succeeded depends on what you believe justice is for. If justice is punishment, the sentence may have been too lenient. If justice is rehabilitation, it may have been too harsh. If justice is the closest approximation of fairness that flawed humans can produce in the face of irreparable harm, then perhaps the sentence was the best the system could offer, which is not the same as good enough and not the same as wrong. The victims at the center of the case were not abstractions. They were Richard, and who raised a flag every morning and believed that order was a form of love. They were Margaret, who remembered everyone's name and believed that showing up was the highest form of care. They were two people in their 70s who had already given decades of service to their community, and then, when their own family fractured, opened their home one more time because that is what they had always done. Their deaths were not symbolic. They were specific, physical, irreversible losses that left specific, physical, irreversible holes in the lives of everyone who knew them. The scholarship, the pantry, the flowers, the memories, all of these are attempts to fill those holes. None of them succeed. They are gestures toward a wholeness that no longer exists. But the gestures matter because they are the only language the living have for speaking to the dead, and they say, in their small and insufficient way, "We remember, we continue, we carry what you built." Chloe Whitfield, behind the walls of a facility that will hold her for decades, occupies a different kind of void. She is the person the case cannot reconcile. She was a child who was failed by every system designed to protect her. She was also a child who planned, with documented precision, the deaths of the two people who tried hardest to save her. Both statements are true. Neither one cancels the other. She exists in the space between explanation and excuse, between compassion and accountability, between the child the community wishes she had been and the person the evidence proved she was. And her future is not a story anyone can write in advance. It will be determined by choices she has not yet made, by evaluations she has not yet undergone, by a parole board that does not yet exist, hearing arguments that have not yet been written. The only certainty is that the 35 years before her first hearing will pass. And when that hearing arrives, the question will not be whether Chloe served her time. It will be whether the time served her. The case also left a quieter question that no courtroom addressed because it is not a legal question but a human one. It is the question that Margaret's sister asked without asking when she said Margaret would have forgiven you. It is the question of whether forgiveness and justice can coexist, whether it is possible to hold a person accountable and still wish them well, whether the act of punishment and the act of mercy occupy different rooms in the same building or different buildings entirely. Richard and Margaret were people who believed in fixing things. They believed that broken did not mean finished. They took in a granddaughter they knew was damaged because they believed their home could be a workshop where a broken child might be mended. They were not naive. They were brave. And their bravery was exploited by the very person it was meant to help, a betrayal so specific and so personal that it transcends the category of crime and enters the category of tragedy. Tragedy, unlike crime, does not have a sentencing guideline. It simply persists. When the courtroom closed and the cameras left and the case files were archived, what remained was a town, a family, and a girl, each carrying a version of the same wound. The town carried the wound of shattered trust. The family carried the wound of irreplaceable loss. And the girl carried the wound of becoming, at 13, the kind of person who ends up in case studies and legal citations, known not for who she was, but for what she did. Whether any of these wounds would heal was not a question the legal system could answer. It was a question for time, which is patient and indifferent, and, unlike judges, renders its verdicts without explanation. The Whitfield case ended the way all true cases end, not with resolution, but with aftermath, not with closure, but with continuation, not with the satisfying click of a lock turning shut, but with the long, uncertain sound of a door left slightly open in a hallway that stretches farther than anyone can see. A justice was served. Whether it was enough is a question only time can answer. And time never speaks. Years pass. They pass the way years due, without announcement, without permission, marked by small changes that accumulate until the landscape is different without anyone remembering the moment it shifted. In Collinsworth, the changes are quiet. A new generation of children attends the school where Chloe once sat near the window and wrote in a notebook. They don't know her name. They don't know the case. They know the scholarship because every spring someone wins it and is celebrated at an assembly where a retired teacher talks about a shop instructor named Mr. Whitfield who believed in doing things right. They know the pantry because their parents drop off cans and mention a woman named Margaret who started it all. The story has been distilled into its gentlest elements, the parts that teach rather than terrify, the parts that honor rather than horrify. That distillation is a kind of mercy, the mercy the community grants itself by remembering the good and placing the rest in a drawer that doesn't need to be opened every day. Richard's flagpole still stands in front of the house on Miller Lane. The new owners replaced the American flag with a seasonal banner, but the pole itself remains, aluminum and steadfast, anchored in the concrete Richard mixed himself decades ago. On certain mornings, when the light hits at the right angle, the pole casts a shadow across the porch that reaches the front door, a thin dark line that moves with the sun and disappears by noon. It is not a monument. It is not a memorial. And it is a piece of hardware installed by a man who believed in rituals and who performed them with the faith that repetition is a form of devotion. The pole doesn't know Richard is gone. It stands because standing is what it was built to do. And in that steadfastness, in that blind loyalty to its original purpose, there is something that feels like the truest tribute a piece of metal can offer. Margaret's photograph at the pantry has been updated 7 times, each new frame slightly different from the last, each one chosen by a different volunteer who wanted to keep the image fresh without altering the tradition. The current frame is simple wood, light-colored, suitable for a kitchen. Margaret smiles from inside it with the easy warmth of a woman who was photographed mid-laugh. I caught in a moment so genuine, it radiates even through paper and glass. New volunteers sometimes ask who the woman in the photo is. The answer varies depending on who gives it. Some explain the full story. Some say she was a friend. Some simply say, she's the reason we're here. All of the answers are true. And Margaret, captured in that single laughing moment, seems to accept all of them with equal grace. In a facility hours from Collinsworth, in a room that has changed 3 times as Chloe has been transferred through the system's age-based tiers, a woman who was once a 13-year-old girl sits with a file that grows thicker every year. She is older now. Her face has lost the soft edges of childhood and acquired the harder lines of institutional life. Whether the years have changed her in the ways that matter, whether the counseling sessions and the group programs and the long, quiet hours have reached the place inside her that the courts hoped they would reach, is a question that will be evaluated formally when her parole eligibility date arrives. Until then, she exists in a state of legal suspension, accountable for the past and theoretically capable of a different future, held in the space between what she did and what she might yet become. The courtroom where Chloe was sentenced still operates, hearing the ordinary cases that constitute the majority of a small county court's calendar: property disputes, traffic infractions, custody modifications. Judge Langford retired 3 years after the Whitfield trial, citing a desire to spend time with his grandchildren. A sentence that carried its own quiet weight given the context of the case that had defined his final years on the bench. His successor inherited the courtroom, the calendar, and the memory. The gavel Langford used sits in a drawer in his home study, not displayed, not hidden, just stored, the way certain objects are kept because discarding them would feel like discarding the significance of what they witnessed. The courthouse steps still receive flowers. The anonymous donor has never been identified and has never missed more than 2 consecutive weeks. The flowers change with the seasons: carnations in spring, sunflowers in summer, chrysanthemums in fall, holly in winter. They are always white. They are always fresh. They are always silent. The story of the Whitfield case does not have an ending because true stories do not end. They echo. They ripple outward from the point of impact and touch surfaces the original actors never imagined. A law student in another state reads the appellate opinion and changes her thesis topic. A school counselor in a nearby county requests additional funding for early intervention programs and cites the case in her grant application. A teenager in Collinsworth, decades from now, wins the Whitfield Scholarship and builds something beautiful with patient hands, not knowing the full story, knowing only that someone named Richard believed in careful work and that belief, passed down through hands and years and quiet acts of teaching, is still alive. The echo does not diminish. It transforms. It becomes part of the architecture of a community that learned the hardest possible lesson about trust and chose not to abandon trust, but to practice it more deliberately, more attentively, more bravely. And in the end, after the verdicts and the appeals and the years and the flowers and the quiet continuation of lives interrupted and lives that persisted, what remains is not the crime. What remains is what was there before the crime and what survived it. A flag raised every morning by a man who believed in honor. A pantry stocked every Tuesday by a woman who believed in service. A community that believed in safety and discovered its limits and chose to believe again anyway, not because the belief was proven correct, but because the alternative, living without trust, was a cost too high to pay. Our Richard and Margaret Whitfield did not die because they were trusting. They died because someone exploited their trust. The distinction matters. It matters because it places the responsibility where it belongs, on the person who betrayed the trust, not on the people who offered it. And it matters because it preserves the possibility that trust, despite everything, remains worth offering. Margaret would have said so. Richard would have simply done it. And the flag would have risen, steady and sure, into another morning. The smirk didn't survive the gavel, but the love survived everything else.